New HUD rule guts Obama program to rezone neighborhoods along income and racial guidelines. Proves Article 1 defunds by Congress work. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In 2015, they had issued a rule basically conditioning $3 billion of community development block grants that go to about 1,200 cities and counties nationwide on making changes to local zoning along income and racial guidelines. This was a utopian program by the Obama administration, basically to transform every neighborhood in America. I think according to some sort of a vision of racial harmony. But really ignoring the local need for the control over these zoning laws. And, most of these 1,200 cities and counties largely depend upon the federal funding of community development block grants to the tune of millions or even tens of millions if you're talking about big cities, and are not really in a position to deny acceptance of those funds because their budgets depend on it. And so, with that coercion, the Obama administration was seeking to, I think, change the way this relationship between the federal and state and local governments would operate. It would turn federalism on its head. And in Americans for Limited Government's view, it was a vast overreach that fortunately is coming to an end now, thanks to the Trump administration and Secretary Ben Carson. They've completed their review of the 2015 Obama-era Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing regulation and have removed requirements for more than 1,200 cities and counties to make changes to local zoning in order to qualify for $3 billion of community development block grants. Under the new rule, which was just finalized on January 14th, 2020, quote, the jurisdictions are free to choose to undertake changes to zoning or land use policies as one method of complying with the AFFH obligation. However, no jurisdiction may have their certification questioned because they do not choose to undertake zoning changes. And this is a huge win for advocates of limited government, as well as those who favor local control over decisions of what to build where. The original 2015 regulation had an explicit requirement calling for changes to local zoning. And this goes back to July of 2015, the original rule under the Obama administration. What it said was, quote, this final rule and assessment tools and guidance to be issued will assist recipients of federal funding to use that funding and, if necessary, adjust their land use and zoning laws in accordance with their existing legal obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. When this came out in 2015, there was a big uproar and there was a bipartisan push to limit HUD's action. Initially, this came via a rider to an appropriations bill by U.S. Representative Paul Gosar, a Republican out of Arizona, that would have defunded implementation of the regulation altogether. And the House, under Republican control, was adopted this rider. Ultimately, however, a Senate version of that rider by Senator Susan Collins was more moderate, and what it did was bar the regulation from being used to affect local zoning. And this passed overwhelmingly in May of 2016, 87-9. And that's just a huge outcome. It shows that there was bipartisan opposition to this regulation. And so 87-9, that means almost all the Republicans and Democrats voted for it. The only people who voted against it were Democrats. And so every Republican was in favor. Almost all of the Democrats were in favor of opposing this regulation and having the federal government make local zoning decisions. And the Collins Amendment was ultimately included in the 2017 omnibus, the 2018 omnibus, the 2019 omnibus, and the 2020 omnibus. It's still a part of the existing law. And it was initially adopted in January of 2017, and was ultimately signed into law later that year by President Trump. And so this gutted the Obama rule on AFFH and made it necessary to revise the regulation in the very least, because it stated, quote, none of the funds made available by this act may be used by the Department of Housing and Urban Development to direct a grantee to undertake specific changes to existing zoning laws as a part of carrying out the final rule entitled Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or the notice entitled Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Assessment Tool. In this author, when in my capacity as Vice President of Public Policy and Americans for Limited Government, I had submitted comments under the Federal Register to look at the this AFFH rule and to revise the regulation to be in compliance with the law. Ultimately, HUD has done that now. They've removed the zoning requirements and have made any changes to zoning now voluntarily. And HUD, with its final action by HUD, has done so. And they want further, finding further legal justification to justify revising the AFFH rule under 42 USC 12705. And what it states under subsection C1 is that for the purpose of the adoption and continuation of public policy identified pursuant to subsection B4 shall not be a basis for the Secretary's disapproval of a housing strategy. When you refer to B4, basically localities submitting an application have to explain whether the cost of housing or incentives to develop, maintain, or improve affordable housing are affected by public policies, including zoning, ordinances, land use controls, and that sort of thing. They have to describe the jurisdiction's strategy to remove or ameliorate negative effects, if any, of such policies. But again, under C1, for the purpose of the preceding sentence, the adoption and continuation of a public policy shall not be a basis for the Secretary's disapproval of a housing strategy. So what HUD is saying in the regulation is that, quote, this provision prohibits HUD from disapproving consolidated plans because the jurisdiction adopts or continues zoning ordinances or land use policies, meaning funds cannot be denied on the basis that the city or county lacked a plan to remove or change the zoning, even if they did find that it was a barrier to affordable housing. Of course, future administrations might read this section of law slightly differently than the Trump administration has read it. And that's, again, it's 42 USC 12705. And a future administration, a Democrat administration, might want to try to do this again, meaning Congress, to be on the safe side, should leave the Collins Amendment as a permanent feature of omnibus bills and appropriations bills. They should just continue that over, and then HUD will never again be allowed to use AFFH to go and dictate local zoning preferences. And so Congress would be wise to continue that prohibition. And besides, there are perfectly non-discriminatory reasons for localities to not change their zoning laws, mainly that in highly densely populated areas, changing zoning might not make housing more affordable. It might shift preferences around. It might change the way the community development block grants are administered. And it just might put federal government in control of local zoning without having any impact on affordable housing because of high demand for housing in certain areas. Americans for Limited Government, President Rick Manning, he praised the HUD action. He said, quote, we are pleased that HUD Secretary Ben Carson produced a final rule that protects local zoning prerogatives while encouraging evaluation as to whether regulations have an adverse impact upon housing affordability. This rightly stops the nationalization of zoning while still encouraging fair housing, once again placing primacy on cities and counties to make the best decisions for their communities. And I think that's right. We don't want the federal government making these decisions. Local boards are always going to be, and having a direct connection to locally elected officials making these decisions, I think is the key point of federalism. And what the Obama rule sought to do was end federalism. It was going to give them a nexus not only to housing and zoning, but it would have had crossover effects into transportation, where you build roads, where you build schools and that sort of thing. It was going to put the federal government in charge of all of that via HUD and other agencies. And I think that that was wrong. And that's why the Senate voted 87-9 against this regulation. And that's why the Congress then went ahead for 4 straight omnibus bills and said, we're not going to allow this regulation to take effect with control on zoning. And that's why now HUD has come forward and they've changed the rule on January 14, 2020. It's no longer required. It is now voluntary to make changes to zoning. And so this is one of those rare instances where a limited government advocate can point to congressional action to limit itself, to limit government. And that's, I think, what Article 1 is all about. It's about using the power of the purse. This could have gone much differently. And without Congress's own actions to defund the 2015 Obama regulation, intrusion into local zoning, this could have gone a lot differently. And I can't say that this rule would have ever been reformed. I'm personally surprised 5 years of advocacy on this issue ultimately made a difference. ALG was one of the few organizations that was out there consistently saying that this needed to be defunded and that Congress needed to assert its prerogatives. And finally, now the Trump administration, they've listened. They've overturned the Obama rule. No more local zoning being determined by HUD. For once, Washington, D.C. Listened. And I'll leave you with the close here. This is a rare example where government can be limited by congressional action using the power of the purse, which now we know it works to rein in government excesses. And we should let Congress know because they should use it more often. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.